All right. So today we're talking about managing social isolation, which we all are becoming experts at because of the COVID pandemic, and just how this isolation affects both staff and residents. So hopefully we will understand more about social isolation and loneliness and the impact it has on us all, and how it's creating trauma, just like natural disasters. Issues with post-traumatic stress disorder can be triggered by social isolation, and what can we do to fight this and improve the lives of our residents. Next slide. I think we'll have the video. Yep. And then we can have presentation and discussion, and we'll go from there. Ooh, poll first. We'll give you a few minutes to answer this. It'll be interesting to see how the new CDC guidelines roll out into all of our places in our lives with no mask if you've been vaccinated. All right, tools exist to identify residents who are lonely or traumatized, and yes, everybody knows that we do have those tools. Projects focus on reducing social isolation require resident voices, yes, and due to sheltering and unpredictability, the pandemic can lead to, and I've always thought this one was funny too, pre-traumatic condition, which can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think post-traumatic stress is right as well, but it's pre-traumatic condition.
Hello and welcome to the webinar titled Social Isolation During a Pandemic and After. My name is Paige Hector. I will be your speaker for this session. When I was asked to prepare this topic, as I often do, I become curious. I start thinking, well, what is the nature of the problem? What is it that we are really dealing with, and how might we go about some ideas for improvement? So much like this little guy here, I just love this image with his little magnifying glass and looking so intently. That's what I feel like, well, what really is the problem that we're dealing with here? So I asked a lot of questions. So isolation, social isolation, well, what is it exactly? Is it a new problem? Is it an ongoing or something different problem? What are the contributing factors, and what resources do we have to address it? And what else do we need? First, I'd like to take you on a quick side trip. I'd like to introduce you to my sister, Shannon. Shannon's a high school special education math teacher, and we often talk about the similarities between education and healthcare. So I recently asked her to make a list of the challenges that she faces as a teacher. Sometimes I find it very helpful to step outside of my world of healthcare and long-term care and look at ideas from a different perspective, through a different lens, so to speak. Oh, here's my sister's list. So as a teacher, on any given day, she is dealing with technology challenges, as all of us are, fatigue and burnout, herself, her kids, her children, the children's families, issues around housing and food insecurity, so social determinants. There's a lot of issues here, and many of them overlap with healthcare. And the analogy I want to make here is, well, all of these impact her ability to provide the best education to her students. Would we expect her or any teacher to solve all these problems? Well, of course not. That would be ludicrous to think that, right? And it's the same idea with our nursing homes. We have so many issues going on right now, so many factors and challenges. There is not one administrator or director of nurses or leadership team, medical director. There's not one person individually that can solve all of these issues. What we can try to do is make a difference. So let me delve a little bit more deeply into our world of healthcare. So in May of 2019, Dr. Nazir, the immediate past president of AMDA, he wrote a wonderful article, and I love the title, "No One Cares When Planes Don't Crash." And he listed things much like the list that I just showed you with my sister. This is an abbreviated list of certain: rising patient acuity, disproportionate reimbursement, dissatisfaction and turnover as a result. It impacts quality of care, and other things that adding to the discouragement and demotivation of staff is the survey process and focus only on deficiencies, media reports, and boy, aren't there a lot of those right now. Negative processes like legislative hearings and lawsuits, of which I think we're just beginning to get a flavor of in this pandemic space. Everything focusing on mistakes. There's nothing that says, look at the wonderful care. There's very little, or maybe there's going to be more of those stories coming to light. The wonderful care, the good things that are happening in our nursing homes. So point out the date again, May of 19. This list from Dr. Nazir was before the pandemic, so we can certainly add a whole list of things related to this added complication. Social isolation is certainly one of them, but again, there's not one person that can solve all of these together. In the history of post-acute and long-term care, there has never been a time that we have needed to come together more than we do right now, because individually we do not have the bandwidth to address all these issues. It's going to require multi-level strategies and collaboration, just like what IHI is doing in conjunction with the ECHO Institute to bring these webinar series to you. So we can still affect change. At the micro level, individual residents and families, we can screen for trauma. Providers can screen for trauma. If we identify residents that are at risk or highly or experiencing trauma, we can refer them for in-depth assessment and treatment when necessary. At the facility level, which I call the meso, the middle level, it's a facility commitment to operationalize trauma-informed care principles, to train and mentor and coach staff engaging in these practices of trauma-informed care. Collaborating with professionals, so when we identify residents that are at risk of or being traumatized, that we have a host of experts that we can engage and get involved to help these residents, because very few post-acute and long-term care facilities will have that resource in-house, that level of training and experience and expertise. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is achieve sustainable culture change, not just change related to the culture of the pandemic. The definition of emotional and psychological trauma is the result of extraordinarily stressful events that shatter a sense of security when we feel helpless. It often involves a threat to life or safety, but really it's any situation that leaves the individual feeling overwhelmed and isolated. And the more helpless or frightened one feels, the more likely they are to be traumatized. Adding to that is the work of Dr. van der Kolk. He's a psychiatrist and trauma researcher, and he talks about the virus being a pre-traumatic condition based on two core variables. Number one, immobilization, literally the inability to move around, being quarantined or sheltering in place. That certainly describes all of our residents right now, right? They're in their rooms, in their little apartment. They can't go out to communal dining or do activities or even out in the hallway for most purposes. Unpredictability is not knowing what's going to happen next. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and even within the day, things are changing as regulations, and we learn more. So protocols change, recommendations change. So when those two variables are present, unpredictability and immobility, the vulnerability to becoming traumatized is great. And again, I keep pointing out that we're talking about residents in this webinar, but I always approach things from the lens of what about staff? This describes staff as well. So a little bit more in depth here with this idea of social isolation. It's actually, there's two issues here, social isolation and loneliness. The social isolation is the objective physical separation, literally people being quarantined in their room or to their homes. Loneliness is the subjective feeling, the subjective distressed feeling of being alone or separated. So these two can exist independently from each other, or they can exist together. So a person can be around other people and still feel lonely. A person can be alone, but not feel lonely or distressed whatsoever. So we really do have to know what it is we're dealing with. Either way, when a human being, when a person loses a sense of connection and community, the perception they have of the world changes. it becomes more threatening, mistrustful, or scary. When we feel those states of distress, that is what triggers the biological defense mechanism that we all know as fight, flight, or freeze. So when our bodies and our minds tell us threat, 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 we're unsafe, the world is unsafe, our environment is unsafe, our body automatically does this. It picks fight if we think we can fight off the threat. We run away if we can't, or we freeze, we dissociate, we shut down. So I'd like to put this in context of our residents, that if a person is coming across the staff as non-compliant or combative, it could actually be that the person has engaged in the biological defense mechanism of fight. That person is struggling to regain or hold on to any semblance of being in charge or being in control. The flight response could appear to staff as resistance to care, uncooperative. It could actually be that that person is disengaging or withdrawing. In a sense, they are running away, they're fleeing. The freeze state might come across to staff as a resident who is very passive or unmotivated and does not care. And it could be that that person is simply shut down, has dissociated, and is just giving in to people in power because they can't run, they can't fight, they freeze. I really appreciated the work of Dr. Nancy Peterson, and she says that we need to identify people who are most prone to suffer from social isolation and loneliness and those who would benefit most from interventions. The interventions for social isolation may look very different from interventions for those who feel lonely. So there's two different phenomena going on here. What they do have in common are the risk factors associated with both: high blood pressure and heart disease, obesity, immune systems weakened, depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline. So all of these things, I think intuitively, we're like, oh yeah, of course social isolation would do all of these things. So what I'd like to hope or think that we're doing as staff is incorporating this in our clinical discussions, talking about when our residents are experiencing a change in condition, that we're asking questions. Are they isolated? Of course, they're isolated, but are they feeling lonely? Are they suffering ill effects related to the distress of being isolated and feeling lonely? Are they experiencing touch starvation? In other words, skin hunger? Literally, when physical contact is limited or eliminated, we can experience touch starvation. So instinctively, as people, we want to touch people. We want to hold and hug and caress. And we can't do that right now. And there's incredible fear around that. And that starvation increases our stress and depression, anxiety. And what that does is triggers the defense mechanism. So really what's happening is that people are in a constant state of arousal, of anxiety. Okay, our bodies are saying threat, threat, threat. It's constant, right? It's around us. It's in our communities. It's every time we as staff go out of our homes, go into work. So all of these things impact our physical well-being, our physiological well-being, and can also lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And even if it's not diagnosable PTSD according to that criteria, it could still be PTSD-like symptoms. So in my work across the country here, I've been having some dialogues in various groups, and we're talking about, you know, when the pandemic, I'm not even sure the right language in here, ends, stops, goes away. Do we believe that once we can touch, hug, and hold the people, do we believe that the negative effects of isolation are just going to disappear? I don't think I do, because the fear that has literally been ingrained into us and for survival purposes, it's not just going to go away. So I think we need to be considering as nursing home staff, what is it going to look like when we can eventually re-enter and re-engage in whatever normal society looks like next? I do like this quotation from Dr. Mochtinger, and he says, my framework for thinking about this is that there are two pandemics, one caused by the virus and the other caused by the trauma and stress associated with the pandemic. He makes the analogy of a natural disaster after which we see increased morbidity and mortality, depression, anxiety, suicide. All of these things happen after natural disasters. The pandemic is no exception. The pandemic still can see increases in all of these. And I'd like us to think, you know, as the weeks and months go on, years perhaps, the people that we receive that come to be with us for post-acute care or to live in nursing homes could actually be suffering from these as well. he talks about there's a predictable second wave of death after exposure to mass trauma. So knowing all of this, what do we do today? How do we mitigate the effects of trauma and social isolation? Well, one of the things, if you're not already doing, is screening for trauma. This is a screening tool I personally recommend, but the National Work Group of Trauma-Informed Care that I've been participating in for a couple of years, this is probably the one that I think most of my colleagues would recommend as well. It's the Primary Care PTSD Screen. It's a 5-question questionnaire, and this is a screen, folks. It is not an assessment. So when we screen residents and they come up that it's indicated that, yes, they're experiencing trauma, the next step is we have to have a plan in place to do a further assessment, to get treatment plan in place. So we need to be intentional about these sorts of tools, that if we begin doing any kind of screening, we have to know what comes next. We have to have follow-up action steps, protocols, and policies. The same with this tool. This is a tool a colleague of mine, courtesy of Dr. Barbara Ganzel. It's a supplement to the tool I just showed you. So basically what this one does, it's looking at the current symptoms, the signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress according to these categories. So look there on the left, it's possible delayed emotional reactions, physical, cognitive, behavioral, and existential. So as we consider how do we talk about these things, what do we do as staff? How do we incorporate this into our clinical operations, our day-to-day work? You know, one of the things you can do is copy and paste this and create a worksheet out of it. It can be used as a direct screening tool where we talk with residents and ask if they're experiencing any of these things, because not all of these things are on that other tool I just showed you, the PC PTSD-5. So this is a supplement. It can be used as an indirect screening tool as well. If you notice there on the right-hand side where it says source. So if the resident is not cognitively capable of answering these questions, perhaps a staff member or eventually families can be able to help. But again, please don't introduce something like this until we have training in place. We know what we're going to do with this information. Where will it be housed? How does it incorporate into the care plan? So we have to work it into our workflow. We need to be talking about the unmet needs. We need to be asking residents about this. I also believe that staff, my work is a lot with staff now as well. So considering the unmet needs and incorporating this again into our work and our clinical and discussions, generally speaking, about residents and what they're experiencing. So here's one of my favorite resources lately. This is from the cupofempathy.com. The creator of this tool is Marianne Van Dyke. She is a nonviolent communication expert and trainer. This is a free download. Go to that website, you can get it. If you'll notice this side here, it says needs. So as human beings, we all have all of these needs and all of these categories. On the back side of this tool are these categories. So notice on the left, the first 3 columns are feelings when my needs are fulfilled. On the right, you'll notice the little orange or yellowish colored line at the top. These are the feelings when my needs are not fulfilled. So think about the residents in your facility right now. If their needs are not fulfilled, are they feeling pain, wretched, lonely, hurt, hopeless, powerlessness, panic, overwhelmed, irritable, anxious, startled? Look at all of those on the right. Now, when they are fulfilled, are they feeling amused, joyous, open-hearted, bright, calm, refreshed? So it gives us the words around, like that little guy in the beginning, the curiosity part. This is the languaging around the unmet needs, the emotions that maybe many of us didn't have training in the beginnings of our careers. Social isolation needs to be included in ongoing disaster planning. This was a huge point that I've been making lately, that the distress of the pandemic, it isn't going to just stop when the pandemic ends, whatever it looks like in the next year or whenever. I don't even know the time frame. So we need to be adopting and sustaining a culture of trauma-informed care, of which looking at the experience of social isolation and loneliness is part of it. So we need to be problem solving as we re-enter community life, community or life as usual. What might be some issues and challenges? the lingering effects of these sorts of traumatic experiences and the fears. What do we need to be prepared for? I will always try to incorporate things into a lens of process improvement, not just performance, but process improvement. The tasks, the things that we do day to day. So process improvement around trauma-informed care. I'd love to see task forces in each of the facilities, and it's not just one person or department. It includes lots of different people, lots of departments, families, of course, and residents. One idea could be around the video technology, video calls. So obviously most facilities are doing this sort of intervention right now, but if you were to take it a step further, if you were to actually think of all the steps and the processes that go into facilitating a successful video call, what would that process look like? What's the process in your facility as it is right now? When a resident wants to make a video call to a family, how does it work? What's the first step? Who does what, when, and how? What's the oversight? What devices? How do you clean them? What are the barriers? What works? What happens if a staff member is facilitating like this in the picture, and all of a sudden the resident becomes agitated, or the family doesn't know what to ask anymore? They don't know they don't know what questions to ask. What are the conversations to start to help focus on rewarding experiences, to be able to name the grief and the sadness, but also to have movement towards smiles and laughter and new shared experiences? What does staff do if the resident becomes distressed or confused? So when you think about the process, it's not just clicking Zoom, opening it up, and here's your wife, your daughter, your son, your partner, whoever. It's the whole process around it. So I think there's room for improvement and to really maximize what staff are already doing so very well. For me, it comes down to this, is that the pivotal change we are talking about must be ingrained culture change, not just adding a screening tool to a list of tasks or putting a generic care plan on the chart. We need sustainable culture change, not just the culture of the pandemic. So in closing, I want to introduce you to someone that I've recently learned about, Nikki Scott B. Jones, and she's known as the Justice Doula. She wrote a beautiful piece called Invitation to Brave Space. And I'd like to leave this webinar with this poem for you. And I hope that you take this poem and you share it with your staff and think about the culture and the space that you're creating in your own facility. Because truly it is all about staying connected and showing up. Invitation to Brave Space by Nikki Scott B. Jones. Together we will create brave space, because there is no such thing as safe place. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we have all caused wounds in this space. We seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect, and this space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together. And we will work on it side by side. To all of you on this webinar and all the people in your facilities, with all of my heart, I extend my deepest gratitude and thanks that we continue to be safe as much as we can to continue to do this work that we all love around nursing homes. And I look forward to coming through this on the other end and hopefully soon being able to see people in person again. Thank you for your time.
So I don't know if anybody has any comments. I think we're kind of past the major part of the pandemic and the cause of all these things, and maybe now we're entering this re-entry phase, and what kind of anxieties will we have at that time. And so, you know, I just went on my first airplane ride since the pandemic not too long ago, and there was anxiety. I almost had a panic attack in the tram at the airport in Denver because just of everybody being so close together. We hadn't been that close to anybody in so long. And so what kinds of things are we going to have with the reentry? And does anybody have any comments on that or experience similar situations?
Dr. Dahl, I will just make one comment. As you're entering into that reentry into maybe the normalcy again, is that really try to take a step back and look at those process improvement. And we've used simple flow charts in the past. We've illustrated in this series where it's 3 or 4 boxes. Look at what process that you're going back to. I mean, you guys have been in such a different environment for the past year. And now that you're trying to re-implement some of the things that you've done in the past, you may just want to take a look at a flow chart and say, you know what, we may have a small gap here. That's an area for, or an opportunity for improvement. And I'll show you one of those flow charts in today's presentation too.
And along those lines, what are the ways that we're engaging residents to help with the isolation, right? And what have you done in your institution? I know we saw back at the start, sometime around Christmas, that some community was having a kind of hunt the reindeer during Christmas time, where they were all kind of isolated and spaced out, but they had guns, Nerf guns, that they were trying to get the reindeers. I don't remember but any other things that you guys did to set up to engage the residents, even though they had to be distanced?
Dr. Dahl, I think I had mentioned this in our one of our previous cohorts as an activity. Something that we did in the nursing homes I worked in is we always had staff parades. And so, you know, even though the residents in this pandemic had to be more secluded to their rooms, you could walk down the halls, everybody could be socially distanced, dress up, just another way to try to engage the residents in an activity and still, you know, spaced out.
I had seen that one group was doing some, what are they, not snap, what are the things where they, oh, it's the young kids are doing it, snaps or something, where they're doing the little dances and getting the residents to do the dance and recording them.
Yeah, I think it's TikTok, if I'm not mistaken.
That's it, yes. Somebody said TikTok.
Oh, Casey put in the chat too, Dr. Dahl, they have their activities department had an artist paint on the outside of the windows for the residents. That's a great idea. And a band playing outside in the courtyards. It's a great idea.
But those are great ideas too.
Way to get volunteers back into the facilities somewhat.
Right. All right. There were some ideas that were going around with keeping residents engaged. They had those virtual trips to the museum. I think they had virtual safaris, but the Museum of Modern Art and Chicago Institute of Art were doing these. There's virtual religious services, which I know kind of every church was putting out, but way to get people involved in the church that means a lot to them. Next slide. Apparently there was a night at the opera, which might engage some. And I know there was certainly lots of other bands, music groups that were putting on kind of Facebook concerts and things as well. I don't know if we're seeing as much of that anymore. People had the idea to do the homemade radio hour so that they were just doing it over their little community. Next slide. Asking the community to submit stories, cards, photos, letters, doing intercom bingo, residents writing what they were thankful for, families sending in photos and making a scrapbook. Themes, which I think are always fun, and dancing, kind of the TikTok we were talking about. Any other things that you guys have done out there? Outdoor carnival, now that the weather's nicer, yes.
Those that have the capability, if there's any kind of online gaming they could participate in with family members. I know some of the games may be a little too difficult for the residents, but there may be some out there. I'm not familiar with video games, just an idea though. And as it's warming up, are you seeing more more visitors? Are you having more outdoor visits? Are there opportunities for that now for most of you guys? I say warmer. You all know I'm in Texas, not North Dakota, so I'm not sure if it's much warmer for you.
It has been nicer, so I think hopefully they're starting to get more activities outside. All right, you can continue to put in kind of the things that you guys have been doing to engage residents to help prevent that isolation or loneliness feeling. And we'll move on though.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Dahl. So in the video that we listened to just a minute ago, she said really you need to culture and how you can push that positivity in your culture. And, you know, for the residents, the folks who affect the residents' happiness and overall demeanor the most are the staff, because they spend more time with them. And especially during this pandemic, they have spent a great amount of time with them in comparison to their families and their loved ones. And so what we're going to start with today is referencing back a one-pager that we had discussed earlier in this series, and it's called the emotional PPE or psychological PPE. And go to the next slide for me. Perfect. And so you guys probably remember us looking at this in the past. I would be curious if you could chat in, if any of you have been able to utilize this tool, or have you been able to do any of these items on the right side as the team leader to limit the staff time or design clear roles, any of those during this pandemic to help support your staff on the front lines. You know, when I was in the facility, I told staff all the time is that you can't take care of our residents if you can't take care of yourself. So what can we do to make you emotionally and psychologically safe in order to be able to take care of our residents? If you think back at, many of you probably have spouses or children, significant others, and when you are struggling with something personally, it feeds onto them. I have 2 young children myself, and I can say that if I'm having a bad day, they're having a bad day. And so it's really important to take a look in and see what it is that you can do to improve yourself, and then you can support your staff, and then the staff improving themselves, and they can support the residents. So I just wanted to bring this piece up again, since we're talking about the resident loneliness, and just make the point clear again that we've got to make sure that our staff are in a good place in order for them to take care of the residents. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Julie, did we have a poll in here?
Yes, we do.
Okay, we'll throw that up real quick. It's really a follow-up to the question I just asked. I didn't see any comments in the chat to see what you guys have done and if you've been able to implement any of those points to improve the staff well-being. It's just the one question. And you know, if there's areas that you can look at, maybe some of these things you weren't able to do for one reason or another, but you feel like it would be helpful to improve the staff's overall well-being, then maybe you can consider that as a performance improvement project, maybe implementing the buddy system or something of that nature. So I just thought this would be a good way to illustrate who or what areas were used the most, and maybe you can look at the others. So a majority have promoted providing the peer support services. I know a lot of facilities or organizations have something, a hotline or employee assistance program where people can call in, and it's an anonymous program where you can provide, or where you get some counseling and things of that nature that can be helpful to those folks. And I know that I believe it was last week in this group, somebody had commented that staff is challenging right now, staffing in general. And so it's kind of hard to provide that extra time off. And so really, if you can try to think outside of the box, if you can't provide them extra days off because the staffing is limited, then maybe provide extra break time during the day, or if there's enough leadership staff to fill in during break times and give them a longer break time or something of that nature. So just kind of look at other opportunities if you can't do all of these. And the buddy system, I know Dr. Juravich has brought it up before. We talk about it a lot in the series, to really have those staff go with somebody and that be their sounding board, so to speak, to help them get things off of their chest. All right, perfect. So with all that being said, like I mentioned, as long as staff can be in a good space, then it makes them in a better place to take care of the residents. So now let's talk a little bit about resident loneliness. And as I mentioned right after the video, is that I was going to show you this simple flow chart to illustrate how you go through that process. So first, you have to determine if there is resident loneliness, then determine what the resident's specific needs are, trial interventions, evaluate success. You can reference back to a PDSA cycle. It's a similar process, but this is just more of a simple flow chart. And we discussed ideas of how to address resident loneliness in the video and with Dr. Dahl's presentation, but we just want to go through this process. And remember that these simple flow diagrams are much easier whenever you're incorporating more staff into participating in quality improvement, because it's just, one, it's visual, and so they can see where their progress is and the pace or the direction they're supposed to go. So we can go to the next slide. So we can consider creating that PIP on resident quality of life and address that resident loneliness. Okay, go ahead and go to the next. So first is determining if the resident loneliness exists. And in order to do that, we need to use some kind of tool to evaluate it. And so it could be as simple as starting with the 5 questions that we've talked about, those 5 attributes, and asking staff some of those common questions. How do we determine resident loneliness? What do we use to determine resident loneliness? To help make that determination if that's happening. And I'll mention again, this is something that you can do during your daily rounding. So remember that just because you're doing something, we're presenting a new idea, it doesn't mean you have to take additional time for it. You can really do it while you're doing your daily routine anyway. Go to the next. And then, do you have a tool already? Is it something that you need to create, or can you just search for one or utilize one that other peers have used? And I would love for you guys to share in the chat if you have some sort of tool that you are using. I know they did share a few on the video that we watched earlier, but this is the purpose of this program too is for us to share and learn together. So if there is a tool that someone has used that has been very successful in determining this loneliness, please share. You can always send it to the ECHO group. And when you are asking staff to help create something like this, if you're creating your own tool, make sure you share those successes with the staff. You can say, hey, CNA Jane is the one that helped us develop this tool because she's very familiar with the residents and knows what makes them tick. So she was instrumental in helping develop this. And that really builds that autonomy in the resident or in the staff, and it really empowers them to participate more in quality improvement overall. Now, if
Kelly, I'd like to just interject that, you know, I think loneliness is a problem in nursing homes, not just during the pandemic, but pre-pandemic, and it's going to be there post-pandemic. And that loneliness, you can be surrounded by people and still experience loneliness. So I don't think this is, it's not, oh, we could have done that, but we're past the time. I think this pertains to going forward forever.
Absolutely. Great point, Dr. Dahl. And, the pandemic, I think, has really highlighted some areas or opportunities for improvement in nursing homes that we weren't aware of, or maybe we were so deep in the weeds and, oh, it's survey window, or, we just got a tag for this, or our census is down. Like we were hyper focused on other things and we didn't really see other areas of improvement. And this is one, as Dr. Dahl mentioned, that was here before and it will continue to be here. So now we just need to monitor it closely and see if we need to put something in place to address it. Remember though, whenever you're looking at a PIP, start small. So look at one unit, one hallway. Do your assessment on 10 residents. Let's see what the results are. Let's see what steps we can put in place and then go from there. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. On the next slide, we have a loneliness scale that UCLA developed. This is just an example of something you could use to assess those residents and determine if something needs to be put in place for them. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Julie or Sarah, we already have this on the website for folks to access.
I believe so, yes.
Awesome. And, in the very beginning, we did a poll and we asked if the resident's voice was important in developing PIPs. Whenever you're looking at this, this is where your resident voice comes in. And then going back to rounding as well, if say all of your leadership team has 5 or 10 patients that you round on a daily basis, then you can ask residents probing questions or even an assessment like this to try to determine if they're having any issues or concerns. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Perfect. I mentioned earlier that, you can look at the PDSA cycle, just do a small test of change. You can use the UCLA loneliness scale to determine if you do have an issue with loneliness in your residents that needs to be addressed. And then also that PTSD scale that was shown in the video, that's another option. And then once again, if anybody has a tool that they would like to share, please feel free to do that. And identify ways to incorporate the resident's voice. Maybe you can do a survey, or maybe your annual survey you do for residents can identify some of those areas, or you could add some questions to that annual survey that you do, so you can assess it maybe on an annual basis if you see that it is helpful. And then always look at your resident and family grievances and concern forms. You may be able to get an idea, or resident council. I know you have to be invited to resident council, but whenever you go, you can have conversations there to try to get a feel for where the residents are and where you can start working that process. And there was lots of examples in the presentation today about some engagement activities for the residents. And now that you all have been able to open up a little bit, then maybe you can start increasing the kind of activities that you're doing to keep them engaged. I will say, speaking of activities and opening back up, I would encourage everybody to ensure that your staff are clear on disinfectants as they go from room to room to provide activities, or if it's your restorative nursing program and they're using equipment from room to room. This is something that I would just use as a refresher. Remember, this is the dwell time on this particular disinfectant for them to go room to room. And if I don't have any questions or I don't see any comments, then Dr. Dahl, I can turn it back over to you.
Sure. I was just going to add that, I've been, we have the virtual American Geriatric Society meeting this week. And so that's what I've been doing the last couple of days. And there's some neat posters presented on kind of ways to combat loneliness in the community elders, which I think would pertain well to the nursing home. And that's, to get engagement of college students or high school students to, either be a pen pal and write letters, or for phone calls and FaceTiming. And there's some really neat stories about that kind of project. So it'd be interesting, if we can engage. I think that helps with the ageism and improve the education of our young people too, to get engaged with our older adults. So I thought those were neat projects.
Absolutely. I saw a video not too long ago. It was a young girl. I want to say she was somewhere between 8 and 10, who would go, or either call, I think it was before the pandemic, but anyway, she would go to the nursing homes locally and ask them what are some special, what would they want? If they could have anything, what would they want? And that she would get responses like, oh, I want an apple pie, a warm apple pie, or I want to play a video game. They were very simple things, but it was important things to the residents. And sometimes it's hard to get real individualized activities for the residents because you have to support all of them. And so one activities director or an activities director and an assistant, sometimes it's hard to get those real special things. And so it was nice to see the community coming in and supporting.